Before Nintendo was regularly making RPGs starring Mario, Luigi, and all their friends, there was actually another developer that made the first one and started it all. The game that would eventually spawn both the Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi series. And that developer was Square. And today, we're looking at the game that Square made for Nintendo, the very simply titled Super Mario RPG. At the time, of course, you could not have chosen a more appropriate developer if you wanted an RPG made. Square had been knocking out hit after hit for the Super Nintendo. Most recently, they had put out the wildly successful Chrono Trigger the year prior. And while it might seem odd, if you were going to contract someone to do a JRPG for you, Square was the best, if not one of the only choices you would have made, especially if you were Nintendo. And it's somewhat fascinating how Square making this first game would influence the Mario RPGs to come after Nintendo took the reins back on design and development. Nothing in Super Mario RPG would be particularly out of place in a Square RPG. Sure, the combat system is far more basic than you would see in Final Fantasy, but Square was no stranger to making wildly different combat mechanics based on the needs of the game. But the biggest addition that Square made to the world of Mario here can be found in the game's story. Obviously, Super Mario as it had existed before Super Mario RPG wasn't going to fit in the narrative-heavy template of a SNES-era role-playing game, and the modifications they made for this game persist to this day, even in the more mainline Mario platformers. And perhaps the biggest key change they made was injecting comedy into the proceedings. And on some level, if you're going to have characters inhabiting the world of Mario, you're going to need comedy. Because so much of that world is so inherently absurd, and a lot of the comedy in Super Mario RPG trades on that. But it also has a lot of humor that doesn't rely so much on the fourth wall, and the dialogue throughout is surprisingly well written, or unsurprisingly, depending on how much credit you'd like to give Square. But unlike revisiting so many RPGs of this era, you don't have to rely as much on the narrative and comedy of Super Mario RPG to carry you through the game. So many of the JRPGs from this era have aged extremely poorly when it comes to gameplay. Now, sure, visually speaking, Super Mario RPG's faux 3D aesthetic hasn't aged that well either. But gameplay-wise, it's aged quite a bit better than so many other Square RPGs of the era. And that's because of the concessions that were made at the time, likely to attract a more diverse group of players to the game. Players that may not have been able to handle the heavy grinding and difficult to understand combat that so many of its contemporaries had. But let's talk about the combat first. The combat in Super Mario RPG will be immediately recognizable to anyone who's played the later Paper Mario or Mario and Luigi games. It's all timing based. It is turn based, but during your turn, if you hit the button at the right time in your attack, or at the right time while you are being attacked, you can either deal more damage or take less damage, respectively. But beyond the difficulty of the combat itself, perhaps the biggest part of this game that helps out is that when you die, you don't lose any XP that you had gained since the last time you saved. Now, physically speaking, it's obviously still a setback. You're still put back at a point in a level, sometimes far away from where you were when you died. But you do so while at least slightly closer to becoming more powerful. And as such, I only really found myself having to do a tiny bit of grinding in the very early game. As the game drug on, I found myself needing to do very little of it. And as such, I can wholeheartedly recommend Super Mario RPG to a modern player, something I hesitate to do with a lot of its contemporaries. Its weirdly modern mechanical intricacies combined with a very well-written story make it worth playing even now. If I was pushed to pick one or the other, I would pick one of the more modern successors to this game, but the original is still such a good game, and it is just as good as it was when it launched all those years ago. In my retro reviews, I look at games that are at least 10 years old, and I see if they've held up today, if they're still worth playing now. If you like that idea, be sure to subscribe so you can see the latest videos. If you like this video in particular, be sure to hit that like button, and thanks for watching.